Tonight, Emma Trimble takes the hot seat and, well, she'll be discussing how the heat is on for Britain's free speech crisis. The Labour Party, they're not too fond of freedom of expression. Angela Rayner is setting up new speech police, a so-called Islamophobia Council designed to criminalise criticism of Islam outright. And who's she reportedly getting to help her? Well, Dominic Grieve, the arch-Remainer who tried to overturn Brexit, now handpicked to police your speech. And meanwhile, Greater Manchester Police have effectively issued a FATWA on a British man who burned a copy of the Quran, naming and shaming him, even listing his address, just days after Salwan Momika was murdered in Sweden for doing exactly the same thing. Reckless in the extreme. And if that wasn't bad enough, Labour's hand-picked expert for the Islamophobia Council, a man called Qari Asim, a man sacked by the Tories for backing religious censorship, now set to advise His Majesty's government on what Britons can and cannot say about Islam. I don't fancy my chances, do you? So is Britain sleepwalking into blasphemy laws? Are our police forces enforcing religious codes? And just how dangerous is this latest assault on free speech? As I say, Emma Trimble is in the hot seat, and it's time to turn up that heat. Emma, thank you very much for your company.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be back on your show, Darren.
Oh, no, absolutely. You've just been telling me that I look like a reject from 2020 during the lockdown eras. But apart from that, Emma, we'll let you off. We'll let you off.
I'm thinking that was the last time I was on.
Yes, yeah, it might well be, actually.
Straight after Black Lives Matter, and we were probably talking about free speech.
That is well remembered. Now, speaking of free speech, the Free Speech Union, I've got to start first of all with that Greater Manchester Police decision to effectively put a bounty on a man's head for burning that copy of the Quran. You know, naming him, listing his address. And given that days earlier, as you'll well know, Salwan Momika, who I found out actually follows me on X, and I didn't know anything about this brave man, murdered in Sweden for exactly the same thing as we saw in Manchester. Are the police now actively endangering lives in the name of hate crime policing?
Yes, straightforwardly, yes. And I think we need to know why it was that the police took that decision, and whoever was responsible for signing that off needs to be held accountable. Because Salwan Momika wasn't just it wasn't just a case of him having burnt the Quran and then being assassinated on this live stream. In the gap between those two things, he was also charged with a hate crime. And the police in Manchester, even if that maybe they weren't aware of that specific case in Sweden, which if they don't, I think that's probably a bit of an indictment, but they are definitely aware of the fact that there is still a man in hiding, the teacher from Batley, who was hounded out of his school and then his home with his young family back in 2021. The man's still in hiding. They know that releasing this information, and not just, they didn't just release his photograph and his name, they released his date of birth, where he lives. They went above and beyond to release information about this guy. And I think it's the Free Speech Union have also pointed out that the College of Policing's own guidance do say that that under certain circumstances, the police don't actually have to release this information. I think they released it even before the guy had been charged with anything. Now, obviously, he's been convicted because he's pled guilty. But they have, like you say, they're basically acting like ayatollahs. They've put a fatwa out on this guy. His life is never going to be the same again. They have pinned a target to his back.
Yeah, absolutely, they have. Now, the question I have then on that is, you can go through Greater Manchester Police's reports, their new releases on crimes that have been committed, etc., and you can find crimes in which a address and a name isn't given. Why in this case is it seen as been in the public interest for a man's life to be endangered?
Well, quite, and I think that's the reason why we need transparency. Because I think was it in Manchester where they had the situation with those guys at the airport who got into a brawl with police officers. I don't think released their names. I don't think they released the names or any details of that family in Hare Hills where there was a riot. I think that was up in Leicester last year. The police very often don't release information. And so in a situation like this, where it is very, very clear that this is sort of reckless endangerment to be releasing his information, it's not just dangerous for him, it's dangerous for his family too. They're saying where he lives. For them to have made this decision to release that information in the full knowledge that they don't have to, that this is exactly the sort of situation that those exceptions are made for, somebody has actively made that decision and needs to be held accountable for it. Never mind the fact that there is a whole separate issue here, which is that this guy was arrested for burning the Quran and has now been convicted of it, and that burning the Quran is regarded as a racially aggravated public order offence, which absolutely should not be, not least because Islam is not a religion. Everything about this situation in Manchester absolutely stinks, and especially after, as you say, what happened in Sweden, because it's borderline from the police. This is borderline incitement against this guy. It's borderline incitement against anybody who behaves in a way that certain extremists within the Muslim community would regard as being blasphemous or Islamophobic. And so that, combined with what the Labour Party are now doing with this Council on Islamophobia, it's practically aiding and abetting extremist mobs.
Well, before we get on to that, to touch on that a little bit more, your own faith, and I don't mean I'm going to ask you to give me the key tenets of your religion, etc., but I do want to know, would you as a Christian be happy for someone to burn a copy of the Bible or the Gospel, for example? Would you be happy for that to take place on the streets of Manchester? Because that's the charge that's coming back. Well, how would Christians feel if this happened to them?
Yeah, it's not the gotcha they think it is, because regardless of whether or not I'm happy about it, I don't think that that person should face any criminal sanctions. I don't think they should be arrested. I think that that Bible is their own property and they can do with it what they like. I wouldn't want to see them treated badly in any way whatsoever, despite the fact that obviously I believe that Christianity is true. I believe that the gospel is truth. I obviously don't think it's ideal for people to go about burning. In fact, I don't feel comfortable with people burning any books. I wouldn't feel comfortable if people were burning, Dostoevsky or whatever. But the reality is that, and Robert Jemrick asked this question: why is it that that there is this double standard between an Islamic sacred text and a Christian sacred text? And the obvious answer to that question is that Muslims will get very offended by it, and some people will go so far as to cause serious disturbances or even murder the person who they think is guilty of blasphemy, whereas Christians won't do that. And so actually it is the rule of the bullies, basically. Whoever is willing to be the most offended and to act out the most as a result is the one who gets the most protection from the law, rather than the other way around. So my answer to people who would say that is no. I don't think that people who burn the Bible should be arrested. And actually some Muslims have come out and said that they would have people arrested also for burning the Bible. I think they think that that's some kind, they drawing an equivalence there is some kind of gotcha, but it just isn't. It isn't.
And the question I have then is, at a time when we find, just read actually in, I believe it was the Telegraph, that asylum seekers, and so they, that's a generous interpretation of what many of them are, but asylum seekers who are in this country are being taught by local authorities how to report hate crimes. And now we find that the definition of Islamophobia will be so broad that Robert Jenrick actually calls it a Trojan horse for a blasphemy law. Is this all part of the same agenda? Is this all part of an attempt to actually silence voices of dissent? Dare I say, like you, Emma?
Yeah, it's actually one of the reasons why I'm so sort of bent out of shape over this, is because I don't, and it's not just me, and many other people have made this point as well, that Ayaan Hirsi Ali has said this is Sharia law through the front door, never mind blasphemy law through the back door. I, as a Christian, do not believe that Islam is true, and I want to be able to criticize Islam. And this is a sort of result of the dynamics of multiculturalism and where we're at now. Because if you have a society where you have all of this diversity, religious diversity, some of the people that you're bringing in come from much more intolerant cultures than the kind of liberalism that the British state at least professes to aspire to. You end up with a situation in which the people who may be coming from those more intolerant cultures, as I say, being the ones who cause the biggest fuss, who are the most offended, are then able to silence those who wish to criticize them. Now, if you actually want to have, presuming that it's possible to have a functioning multicultural society, you cannot have the complete withdrawal of the state or the state siding with those who would be the aggressors. They need to protect those who want to criticize those other cultures and religions and beliefs as well. And so I think me and many others who are critical of certain things, and it's not just Christians, it's not just critics of Islam, it's also apostates, ex-Muslims, Muslim feminists, people who, they like to make, the Labour Party like to make themselves appear to be very welcoming to refugees. Well, genuine asylum seekers, people who I think we should genuinely be allowing into this country, who have real grounds to be here, are people who are persecuted in countries like Pakistan. Maybe their lives are at risk because they have committed blasphemy or something. And now if they were to come here, they would just be arrested just the same and treated appallingly because the state sides with those who would want to enforce blasphemy laws. So I really don't think that it is possible for us to overstate how dangerous this is, and not least because, as you mentioned, Dominic Grieve is going to be chairing this council that Angela Rayner has put together. And he's hardly a neutral chair. He wrote the foreword for the APPG Islamophobia report that put forward the definition in the first place, that people from all religious backgrounds, including some Muslims, were saying this is a blasphemy law. Taj Hargay, a very prominent Muslim, has been coming out and saying that he thinks that this is a bad idea and that people should be able to criticize Islam. So what it functions as is just a mechanism for protecting Islam from any criticism, because, as the APPG report says, criticisms of Islam are weaponized to marginalize and stigmatize Muslims. So I couldn't say, for example, that I think that Muhammad was a liar, which I obviously do because I'm not a Muslim. So I don't believe that he was telling the truth. I don't believe that the Quran is the truth. And they would say I'm being Islamophobic by saying that.
Yes, so would you be Islamophobic if you mentioned Asia, for example, as not the continent, as in the girl that Muhammad was, as the story goes, what was she, 9 years old?
Well, that's a very good example because the APPG report actually does specifically say, as an example, along with grooming gangs, along with saying that Islam was spread by the sword, says that saying that Muhammad is a paedophile is Islamophobic. But then what do you do if, say, you wanted to have a public discussion of the particular hadith where it says that Muhammad married Aisha when she was, I think it was 6, and then consummated the marriage at 9. So can you have a conversation about that? I mean, people, I think, would feel uncomfortable even now before there are any laws in place, would feel uncomfortable mentioning that because they would think somebody's going to accuse me of Islamophobia.
Well, exactly. So it's not a chilling effect. This is an ice age for speech, right? This is what this would mean.
We're already in the ice age.
Yes. Yeah.
And this all this Islamophobia, formal definition of Islamophobia would do, because remember, the Labour Party's already adopted this as a party, even if it's not the law of the country. All this would do is make that concrete. It would make it so that, and as this guy who burnt the Quran up in Manchester, he seems to have made it quite clear that he was doing this as an act of protest. The intention behind it wasn't any racially aggravated public order offence. It was just because somebody might feel that insulted by it, as the victim statement said from the passerby, gave his victim statement saying that this broke his heart and he's never felt so emotional about anything. Well, surely the thing to do is to say, well, actually, in a civilized society, how you feel about somebody else's legitimate actions, how you feel about somebody else's act of protest is sort of besides the point.
Well,
That's
quite.
that's not an issue for the state to protect you. And then you have the judge coming out and saying, we're a tolerant society, but we don't tolerate this. So the judge is effectively saying the only thing that we tolerate in this society is intolerance towards the person who's doing the act of protest because someone is offended because it's their sacred text.
It's baffling. It is, and the permanently offended are enabled and given tools to use in this battle. And the one example I picked up on was this Qari Asim, who one of the figures of the this proposed Islamophobia Council is this man, and he's an imam that was actually sacked by the Conservatives in 2022, the Conservative government, for backing the banning of a film on Islamic history. Now, Labour reportedly, at least, want him advising them on freedom of expression. That in and of itself is really quite revealing, because if he is influencing the official definition of Islamophobia in law, how can we possibly expect legal protections for free speech and philosophically held beliefs, even under the Equality Act, to be protected? Because Labour are saying that this is about protecting Muslims from hate, but it isn't. This is about protecting Muslims from what I would argue is perfectly reasonable, rational criticism.
It's a perfect example because it shows the impossible crossfire that this creates. Because in that case, I think that film was a Shia film, and was regarded as beyond the pale by the Sunni community. And so, actually, this is the problem with the censorship that arises from multiculturalism. That in order to manage multiculturalism, you have to silence certain people, and inevitably you end up taking sides, and usually that is going to be the side of the person who is most forthright, probably the aggressor, the person who bullies the most, who screams the loudest, who threatens the most consequences. And so it's those minorities within minorities, whether they're gay people, apostates, Muslim women, dissidents, critics, dissenters within the community, or even between communities. So if it's the Shia or the Ahmadiyya community, those accusations of Islamophobia, which are another way of saying blasphemy, can be, there can be a crossfire even within the Muslim community, because some Muslims don't regard the Ahmadiyya as being within the Muslim community. And so whose side does the state take? The Ahmadiyya's side because they identify themselves as Muslim, or do they side with those who would exclude them from the community? So you end up with this complete mess where the state has to take sides, and therefore the state has to privilege as official in some way probably the ideas of those who have appointed themselves. And so this example of Qari Asim is a very good one. Because that's an example of basically an Islamophobia dispute within the Muslim community that also relates to freedom of expression in terms of what the British public can see at large, because this is effectively a blasphemy law that would be imposed on the whole of the British public. So what I would say about this council is that even with the little information that we have now, it is very clear that it's a stitch-up. It's rigged. We know which way this is going.
100%.
It's some version of the APPG definition and Islamophobia. And if you remember also, the Labour MP stood up in Parliament and said he wanted a blasphemy law for all of the Abrahamic faiths, never mind the fact that's impossible because all of the Abrahamic faiths blaspheme against each other. I think it's so offensive to say that Jesus Christ was just a prophet rather than the Son of God. And I'm sure that they would think that I am blaspheming because I think that Jesus Christ is the Son of God rather than a prophet. But when he stood up in Parliament and he says, we want a blasphemy law for, including the desecration of religious books, for the Abrahamic faiths, but what about Sikhism? Many Sikhs were concerned about the Islamophobia definition because some of the aspects of their own faith, because of its history, would get caught up in this definition of Islamophobia. So then the definition of Islamophobia would be what? Persecuting those of the Sikh faith? It's unworkable, but you can see how it is the road to tyranny. It's the road to people not being able to criticize the more extreme end especially of Islamism, which is why I think Richard Walton, the former counterterrorism chief, said that this would hamper our ability to do counterterrorism.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the police's ability to actually enforce the law and to look into issues. This with the grooming gang scandal wasn't investigated because of political correctness. Imagine the sheer scale of people being scared to act on what is blatant extremism because of the fact that they're scared they'll fall foul of these new hate speech rules. We're a country where we banged up people after the July protests because of the fact that they had posted things online. European governments are cracking down on this. Canada is cracking down on this. Britain is very much on the same path, if not the world leader. Is this just a soft theocracy? Because, I mean, someone I would have loved to see you talk to actually would have been Christopher Hitchens, for obvious reasons. Now, he warned that back in 2009, and probably even before that Islamophobia would be used to silence criticism of a very extreme and absolutist ideology. Are we actually now living in the exact world that he predicted? Do you think if Christopher Hitchens could be brought back from the dead now, or maybe when we meet him in another life, he'll say, I told you?
Yeah, completely. I mean, this has been going on now for so many decades. We have repeatedly, time and time again, emboldened those who have tried to impose blasphemy laws in Europe, whether it was the Danish cartoon affair, whether it was Charlie Hebdo, whether it even the murder of Theo van Gogh. I know one of the people who's been commenting a lot on this has been Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was a friend of his, and then she left and went to the United States from the Netherlands. It's too dangerous for her to be in Europe. There have been endless examples of this where the craven response of European states, European governments, have only emboldened those who take the most extreme position. And I mean, I would love to know what Christopher Hitchens thinks of the current situation, because at this point it's become so entrenched that we're doing it to ourselves. We don't even need a mob to descend. We're imposing the blasphemy laws ourselves. The Labour Party has swallowed this narrative wholesale. They don't need any Islamists to be telling them that they need to crack down on any criticisms of Islam or blasphemy. They're quite capable now of doing that themselves. And so I think we really, the situation is, I mean, I'm sure it's going to get much worse, but I think it's currently as dire as it's ever been. Just simply the fact that somebody can be convicted of a racially aggravated public order offence for burning a Quran, and actually the fact that this council is being set up off the back of this RICU report that recommended an increased reporting of non-crime hate incidents of Islamophobia. And that report, and RICU itself has said that talk of two-tier policing is a right-wing extremist narrative. And so for us to point out that the response to various different, protests or riots has been, let's say, less than even-handed and constitutes a two-tier system, that it's not just two-tier policing, but it's also two-tier justice in the way that different people from different communities are treated when they behave in certain ways. For us to point that out, the Home Office, this unit in the Home Office, evidently thinks that that is indicative of being far right. And then you have the Islamophobia report itself that very clearly states, and I mentioned that quote where they talk about how criticisms of Islam are used to stigmatize and marginalize Muslims. The very next sentence, the example it gives is talk of grooming gangs. So all this is going to do is, so we've got this situation where we've got this multicultural society that isn't working, the model is broken, we don't have a way of managing certain groups of people that are much more intolerant than society is more broadly. We have no way of managing that. And then what the government is going to do is impose something and further an agenda that is only going to make it completely impossible to deal with any of those problems. So throughout all of those decades, as you say, from when Peter Hitchens was talking about this, through all of the various different controversies that we've had of people who have offended by, showing or publishing pictures of the Prophet Muhammad or whatever, throughout all those years, we have just been tying our hands and our legs, and now we've got ourselves into a situation where it's almost the final nail in the coffin. You won't be able to criticize Islam if this gets much worse.
Well, Emma, just to end, a final brief question. Is the saving grace that this is just completely unenforceable?
It would be interesting to see how they enforce it when they do end up with, and actually the example of the school situation is quite a good one. Not the Batley school, but if you remember when there were
the
protests,
scuffed Quran.
Not the scuffed Quran.
Not the scuffed Quran. There are so many.
If you remember, there was a controversy. Everybody's got such a short memory now. Everyone sort of forgets that there was a big protest over the LGBT curriculum within schools, and a lot of Muslim parents are very unhappy about that. That was a very good example of the those who have sort of swallowed identity politics wholesale, not being entirely sure who to side with. And so when they eventually get caught in the crossfire of having to negotiate between certain people within the Muslim community who maybe are accusing each other of Islamophobia, or maybe an ex-Muslim who, or a Muslim feminist is making a particular, so a good example of this would be Sharia courts. That there have been women who have, and I've written about this extensively and interviewed people about this, where Muslim women have said the reason why the government won't deal with Sharia courts is because they're afraid of being called Islamophobic. And so Muslim women continue to face discrimination at these Sharia councils because nobody cares. They've just been written off because they're part of a certain community. But these problems have been on the table for such a long time that I imagine actually, even if it is unenforceable, it will just make the two-tier issue even worse. They will have to take a side in order to make it enforceable. And so then you'll have certain views that become the kind of officially privileged position, or certain communities that have sort of extra protection that other communities don't have. So I actually don't have much faith that the inherent contradictions in this will lead it to fall apart and be unenforceable. I think they'll try to enforce it, and what it will do is just entrench injustice even further.
Well, I do agree with that, and I think actually, the Tommy Robinsons of the world are perhaps the canaries in the coal mine. I think that there'll be, whether the issues around contempt of court and all these other things, I get all that, but there are people that are still in prison for tweeting things, and I think that that's just going to get worse and worse, Emma. So I've tried to end on a little bit of optimism there, but I think we're both a bit yeah, I know, no, that's all right, it's not your fault.
Nice try.
What I would say though is that, with voices like yours, Emma, with voices like the Free Speech Union, Ironhurst LE, of course, as well, there are so many brave and honourable people out there that we won't go down without a fight, and I'm pretty sure of that. I'm pretty damn confident about that. And as you say, the contradictory nature of these competing victim hierarchies, that's going to become more and more prominent. And I wonder how someone like Owen Jones, who's obsessed with Gaza, is going to feel when actually he finds that more Muslim representation in Parliament means less support within Parliament for his trans pet projects and stuff like that.
Unfortunately, I think that they'll realise the deal they've made a little bit too late, and it's not far from what happened in Iran, where the left helped the Ayatollahs to take power in Iran, and then quickly discovered the consequences of that unhappy friendship.
Well, Emma, I think we've definitely covered enough ground to, 1, get ourselves arrested, 2, hopefully not get ourselves hurt, but 3, definitely warrant a drink at some juncture in the future. Emma Trimble, thank you. I nearly said it again there, Emma Webb. I must get over this. Emma Trimble, thank you very much for your time.